Well, Justice, first of all, I want to thank you all for sharing your time with us. Listening about the judgments that you talked about, especially the last one, well, to me, I could see that there is a desire of the court to provide guidelines to the authorities, uh, to different sections of the government as to how to act, how to decide and judge these types of cases. My question is, how has been taken by magistrate judges and lower courts or other parts of the government? Silencio, por favor. We can see here something very interesting is if we see comparisons to what happens in the U.S. When the U.S. began its constitution and began an territorial expansion that is included, where Arizona is included, indigenous or the original indigenous communities uh, were marginated, and in certain our areas they were, say, segregated. And what happens to their rights? They continue applying their own local rights, their ancestral rights. In the case of indigenous communities in Arizona, they continued on with their ancestral rights. So people start becoming westernized, and we see the advantages of the Western right systems. And there are many cases where the American judges had to decide if they would use traditional uh, uses and customs according to ancestral rights or American legal rights. So especially if it's had to do with sale of land. So in regards to your questions, what happens with Mexican rights or Mexican law? Well, in the southeast of the question of the country, where there are large Indian populations, they continue using their ancestral rights to solve their disputes. Although those ancestral rights are very rudimentary, we would have to decide if it's accepted or not. It's interesting the recognition that we made as a court to those jurisdictions, those indigenous jurisdictions. And I've spoken to Oaxaca courts, which is the authority there, where they said, well, at least it was decided what we had judged within our courts in Oaxaca through the indigenous uses division will be confirmed. So what would happen before when somebody from a community would leave and say in the US there's quite a bit of movement, people that return to their indigenous communities and have a different mentality, a different cultural mentality that they want to apply there. So we, as an example, we talked about Eduardo's case. Eduardo had a cultural level that was a bit above the rest of the community. And he thought that if these were communal laws, aside from their being reforested or not, and that they would receive money from international organizations to support these forests, well, it would be to their detriment. And if it's the communities, it belongs to everyone, so I can use it as well. Because private property within indigenous Mexican communities was not exercised or not exist as such, but these were communal lands. In fact, even in Oaxaca, we can still see this. They have collective work towards the collective, where all of the members of the community are cited by municipal authorities in order to perform community work such as roads, dams, and even homes, schools, etc. So this, in a way, is westernized, and some inhabitants, being westernized, say, "Well, why should I be working Saturday and Sunday to benefit the community, to plant trees that will be for the collective, the benefit of the collective?" So, the reception to this was something that many people talked about. That, and I'll send this to you because some indigenous groups are in the USA still have similar conflicts as nations and towards their legislation. In the case of Arizona, for example, talking about the casinos and production of certain substances, we had many legal matters, many criminal issues, because in these states there are communities where there are religious ceremonies where these substances that are considered drugs, like peyote and other substances, that will be consumed for certain religious ceremonies of initiation and so forth. So these rights have evolved quite a bit. And I think this is the first time that we really, in the court, looked into a concrete matter in regards to those interests. Uh, Traditionally speaking, they would say, well, no, they would placed in jail or fined where they shouldn't have, and this should not have happened. I think it's a way of recognizing the rights of these communities that really helps us. These are things that we think that we may not be interested in, maybe only things that have to do with a lot of money matter, but no, these are interests of justice, and it's our obligation to be present in all of these issues. Thank you very much for the question. Any comments? Well, yes, thank you. And I'm not sure if there are any other questions, but did you have another question, sir? Do you see a problem in the application of these rulings from the court and these decisions as something more at a local level in these cases? Well, in this concrete case, when someone goes to a district judge, which is a federal court, stating that their rights have been infringed or violated, well, the change that I'm going to talk about in a moment about precedent creates the obligation for these courts to look at different points of view to respect as is possible in regards to human rights. The importance of that these have. You just went through an electoral process that was very singular, very important as law students concerned about the political situation in your country. You all followed this electoral process in the U.S., where the fundamental pillar is the suffrage, is democracy, open democracy, where everyone votes as they want to. Within indigenous communities in Mexico, authorities in some of these communities decides who people will vote for. So the conflict that we had in these electoral processes was that those who do not agree that all the community would vote for one person because that's what the elder council decided. Well, there were people that said, well, I don't want to vote for that party. I don't like them. So one person would decide who everyone had to vote for. So how can we make feasible the understanding of these procedures? Another example that I have, in our country, we do accept that the obligation of uh, giving a space to men and women, that we would have a certain number of men and women in voting. And in certain communities, they would propose that it would be a woman, their ancestral laws, considering that women were inferior in political issues or they shouldn't get involved, the community decided not to present this woman and take her off the list where she would be a candidate. So, what does the Electoral Institute do? And then what does the Electoral Court do? They recognize the rights of women to participate. And here we have to think, well, are we going to continue with uses and customs of one person? Will we support uses and customs that stating that only men can decide and be part of a council within a community? Or shall we respect the obligation that the Mexican state has that, well, women should be part of decision-making units? So also pay attention to customs in which are perfectly valid as well. I was concerned, and I'll tell you this quickly, the story. What was I concerned with? I was a magistrate judge, civil in Mexico, which is the largest court in the nation. I would go visit also criminal uh, issues, and there was an issue of a man in the southeast that had been detained for extortion. This gentleman had not been given the attention of having an interpreter in order to explain what the issue had been. That man had sent his daughter to work in Mexico City. She was a minor. And one of these parties that the owner of the house had had, and he had had a fight with his wife. Well, he ended up forcing her to have sex. This man, who was a policeman, when the woman tells him by telephone that the father had had a relationship with her, so this man comes and asks for money. And this is the custom in his town. And since everything had been recorded, they put him in jail for asking for money for having had her daughter pregnant. And in the community, if somebody abused a minor, they were under the obligation, according to customs, to pay them. So we looked at this matter, and from the point of view of customs, and we provided an interpreter for his dialect, and we saw what the issue was. He wasn't trying to extort the man, father of the child that the girl had had. So these are things that our lack of knowledge about what happens in certain parts of our country helps us understand. I'll give you other examples. I remember a case that a friend told me about of a young man who went with his girlfriend to live in the US and has children. The girl was 15 and he was 19. So it had been considered he had crossed with a minor, although that this is a relationship they had already formed. But in our countries, he would say, well, to ask for somebody's hand in marriage to the parent, it's as if he were already married. It's like any marriage, as in Texas or any other country. But being in the U.S., having sexual relations with a minor, well, that was an issue. So you can explain a sheriff in the U.S. county that he's not abusing of this person. This is his partner as far as he saw it. So that's why it's very interesting to see what are the customs and traditions of these communities. I studied in the University of Uppsala in Sweden, and I was very surprised to see how a man that was coming from Turkey who had attacked his wife and who would beat his children because they were too noisy, they wouldn't let him sleep. The police came and had separated them. And in Turkey, What's normal is the husband was upset and the food wasn't warm, he would beat her up. And this is what happens in many communities in the world. And how could he had hit a woman? He could not do that in Sweden. You can imagine the scandal. So that when the police comes and takes him away and they kick him out of Sweden, they deport him. Well, he said, well, that's what we do in my country. Those are the customs. Well, I hope that I answered your question. Any other questions, or shall we go to our next subject before you fall asleep? Moderator? No? I will. Go ahead. There's a reform that is about to begin. This is called federal judicial power reform. And just like in the US, we have local jurisdiction and federal jurisdictions. We're always, every time we're going to change, uh, we have academicians and attorneys that present their opinions. And I think it's very interesting what society can tell us to understand from a constructive perspective and a critical perspective what we expect and what we would want to achieve. I don't want to substitute those voices that talk about the importance of a reform, a judicial reform, but I will condensate very simply what was presented and what will the impact be for our judicial system, but also talk about certain instruments as, for example, how we can reconfigure a new role for the Supreme Court within the exercise of the law. So to talk about fair law, well, we know we have many enough examples to know that ideas don't coincide with reality, and that's why that I consider that to think about the importance of the judicial uh, powers should not be considered something that is circumstantial. So precisely here, the ideas of the rights and justice should have a clear coincidence and correlation to what we see in our daily lives. We need to stress the importance of peoples to know clearly what is the role of judges in our country. And if these two things, two aspects are not uh, placed forth, there is a risk that we wouldn't consider these rights. And like Victor Hugo said, there are a series of problems that could arise. We should stress that to place this power only in one institution would decrease their significance as a political force within the Mexican uh, system. Today, we wouldn't be able to understand this political system without considering the impact that judges have had in different social and financial aspects. So considering this as an institution that is political and judicial at the same time, we see the importance of these proposals to reform our system, and this is a great example of self-critique, institutional self-critique, where we recognize the great challenges that we have in our federal justice systems. There are many changes that this reform for the Mexican legal system has, and we'll only talk about the most important ones. The new judicial school, the strengthening of public defenders, and the measures that exist, and the fight against corruption, nepotism, and also sexual harassments, as well as measures of equality and changes in jurisprudence. I will begin with uh, talking about uh, the strengthening of of law school or of a career in law. We need to have specialization and training for those that are involved in these functions. What we are proposing is that through a law in regards to legal education, we propose that the country would have an honest person that can provide justice to all. This institution will not only be in charge of all of the different posts, but also have the goal to guarantee the highest standards of training and studies of the law in order to become important nationally and internationally speaking. The strengthening of these types of institutions through reforms is also something important for and a guarantee of this, but we should also approve different evaluation schemes of performance through exams and periodic evaluations in regards to competency. The results of these evaluations will be a base for recognition and also in regards to separation of judicial powers and strengthening of public defenders. I also like to say that we need to stress these reforms, and this is one of the one of the best things that we have done. Improving these services, we want to see people, attorneys as participants in our system so that we would have a judicial system for it to work correctly. We need to strengthen attorneys and judges. This new legal, these schools will have a specialized um, way of having people become public defenders, and they will become attorneys of those who really need them. And justice should also reach everyone in our country. Measures against corruption and nepotism and sexual harassment as well shall be included. We also have a new law that would provide a tool to combat corruption and nepotism, the corruption of judges. In order to fight against this, they would have the powers in order to dictate different measures and suspension of judges while the investigations continue on and judgment is made. Other measures that are proposed is the possibility to visit different courts and look into issues that are deemed necessary. In regards to nepotism, it is established as a cause of responsibility the naming of a family member, and those who violate these rules shall be canceled out. To combat sexual harassment, it is stated that we should have, whenever there is a sexual harassment to another person, without their approval, this shall be taken into account. Let's go, please, to English. Switching.
So that they can be sanctioned whenever they look for benefit, work benefits in exchange for sexual favors. Ya estoy hablando. Oh, oh. And also the gender equality is a principle of the judicial career to guarantee the effective use of human rights with public institutions that can make it operative. The transversality and progressivity of this policy will assure that there are institutions in charge of it. One important aspect that will come up is the change in the jurisprudence system or precedent. The High Court needs to advance to a precedent system where every one of the opinions be relevant in the public life, meaning that precedent is not just an evidence of law, but it also can be a source of law. So it is sought that the court that uh, five opinions constitute a precedent for all the courts in the country. And it is proposed that the um, findings in the opinion will be mandatory for all the courts in in the country without having to repeat them, as long as they have been approved by 8 votes when it is a court in when it's a full court, and 4 votes when it is in the different divisions. Another one is the creation of regional courts as permanent organs of the judicial branch with the purpose of unifying criteria of the collegiate courts in the area, and this will give consistency to justice. Also, the proposal of the judicial reform that we condensed on the relevant issues wants to reform 7 constitutional articles, modify 5 laws, and within all the work that this entails, the judicial reform wants to eliminate the motions for reform and to admit or revise direct amparos. This would imply, among many other things, that the presiding judge would decide which are the relevant cases that the court will take. And there have been many commentaries regarding uh, political the politics of it, and it will be determined by the president of the court's criteria for admission for relevant proposals. And this is through applying for the consolidation of cases and taking on and jurisdiction of the different cases. Even though, even though these come from different principles, these are extraordinary mechanisms that will allow the citizens to bring their cases up to the highest court. And this has many advantages. First, because this is practically a discretionary issue, as long as the relevant criteria are met. So we will arrive at a great judicial reform. No doubt it is a big challenge that we are facing. However, I am sure that when all the branches of the government converge, we can reform the judicial branch. We can reinforce the institutions of the judiciary and the capacity, and that will uh, bring to life the idea that underlies the judicial system, which is that the law exists for the good of all the people, as complex as that is. And a direct effect of that reform will be the strengthening of the role of the courts in that consolidation of the standards of debate, and specifically in the Supreme Court of the country. Time will tell if we succeeded or not. Thank you very much. This was very brief. It is not a very wide judicial reform. It's just a first step that we want to take within the judiciary. I am open to any questions you may have. You can now bring suit against Juan Vega for the damages for having you here on Friday afternoon. I would never forgive him if I were you. Comments? Anything?
Adelante, Omar. Creo que tienes una pregunta, ¿no?
Omar, you have a
No,
question?
más que nada también
No,
que Alan Muchísimas
Just
gracias
like Alan, I would like
por tu
to thank
tiempo.
you very much, Justice
Este,
Gonzalez, for your time and for all this sharing this great knowledge.
Reforma
My question is very simple. The judicial reform, is that something that is it underway? Has it been approved? It was approved by Congress. It was approved by Congress. It was approved by Congress. The senators and the representatives have approved. The senators were the origin. Reforms to institutions of the judiciary come from the executive branch usually. It was usually the president of the republic that sends it to Congress and Congress approves or denies it. In this case, since it is not a distinct judicial reform, the judiciary asked the country, the president, to embrace some improvements, and the president had no objection to underwrite them. And then it went first to the Senate, where it was approved, and then to the representatives. Since we have the reform of some constitutional articles, it has to go to the states and has to be approved to be in the Constitution. But there are other laws as well that hinge on that reform that will have to be prepared by Congress to implement the complete judicial reform. I think it will take a few months. I remember at Harvard at a talk that I had with the dean in the 70s or 80s. Apparently, there was a meeting of judges and justices of the Supreme Court of the US. And what pained them all was they were all saturated with work. So the need to reinforce the alternative resolution systems such as mediation, conciliation, arbitration, etc., and decentralize these issues, and the possibility that courts could send mediators to resolve disputes alternatively. In the past, whenever had an issue, they could go to the Supreme Court, and then we would have to work issues that really are not as relevant as others. So now we're going to copy, in a way, the US model where the justices, there are two more, there are 11 in Mexico, there are two divisions, five apiece, and we will, only a few matters we see all of us together, and then we can take in matters like the judges do in the US courts. Uh, Cases that are interesting, that are very relevant, also academic cases, and we will be able to choose what we believe is uh, more important and more relevant in our work.
muy bien, muchísimas gracias.
Very well, thank you very much. Sure, Omar. We'll give you an abstract. We'll send you an abstract of what the judicial reform is. Uh, we will send you some materials in that regard so that you can peruse them. And with the excellent translation, you can figure out what it means. Thank you very much, Justice Gonzalez. We have another question from Professor Miguel Stairs, who is on the translation side, so she can ask the question, but she would like to know if could you go more in depth on regarding the reform of the judicial school to train the public defenders. Uh, so as a country, we thought that law schools, and the US has the same issue, that law schools really train their students and that they come out ready to litigate. We don't have the limitation that you have to be accepted to go to the Supreme Court in the United States. We don't have the system that English barristers uh, and lawyers have, solicitors and barristers, where they do lower procedures and then the barristers can go all the way to the Supreme Court. What did we see in Mexico? We saw that there was a great growth in law schools And unlike the US, where there is the law schools are qualified and they're classified, yours is one of the more prestigious ones. We need to reinforce the knowledge of the people who graduate from our law schools. So there was a federal judiciary institute to create and establish adequate levels for the judges, and especially with legislative changes, it was being necessary for them to update their knowledge. So it was a judicial school. This judicial school will have the ability to establish the admission exams and the retaining exams for officers, court officers. And regarding the public defenders, uh, sadly, one of the problems with the Mexican system is that public defenders don't have the training in general to defend defendants that would allow for them to really defend their cases in criminal cases. Unlike what we have, uh, or in Canada, for instance, where the attorney has the obligation to have the case for the state, or the German public defender, where they don't have an institute, but they hire lawyers and they pay the lawyers and by the fees that the country sets. We, in the federal court, we give an attorney to whoever cannot afford the lawyer. On television series, when they arrest someone, you have a right, the Miranda rights, and if you don't have an attorney, we will pay this government will pay for one for you because of the number of cases they have and the quality of the blood defenders. They left people without their adequate defense. So the Mexican Judicial Institute will train those lawyers who will be the defenders, the public defenders, like it happens in other countries. Why? Because the attorney that has good training will go work for a firm with a much higher uh, wage than the state attorneys. And we don't have that obligation to take on so many cases in our practice, or we don't defend the cases so carefully. So that's going to be a fundamental shift to train and update and allow people to have an adequate defense, which is a underpinning of any system in any country that wants to mete out fair justice, as I was saying at the beginning. Our friend, the translator, didn't translate it. Was that clear?
Muy bien. Muchas gracias.
All right. Thank you very much, Justice Gonzalez. I don't know if anyone has any questions. I do, but go ahead. Go ahead. Or the time will run out. It's regarding. I know it doesn't behoove the federal judiciary, but do you see that the states will follow uh, partially or completely this judicial reform to do something with the state judicial power? Yeah, there is an initiative by the Association of the Presidents of the Superior Courts of the State, CONATRI, that has had meetings with the Arizona State Bar and with the Arizona courts to form a national judicial school, like they have one in Spain, to be able to train the lawyers at the state level and the public defenders for the states and the judges, the state judges also. I feel that a judicial school uh, that could train the different entities in the law and on national level with the knowledge and the support and the quality can have extraordinary results. What do we owe to the pandemic? A lot. And one of the things that we need to bear in mind is that things are not going to be the same anymore. Uh, In-person training is going to be different. There is fatigue in general, but because we spend so many hours watching conferences on Zoom. And in the past, there were things that that didn't happen. So optimization of resources, as is happening now through electronic means, is going to help us a lot. And I feel that the states should unify their efforts to have a better quality of trainers, as it happens in some European countries. I believe that's the new challenge uh, when as we cross borders, because now you are in the United States and I'm in Mexico. We're many miles away, but this will make us closer. It will allow us to understand each other's problems and how we solve them. And I feel that law schools throughout the world will also be changing. Those famous case books that are so heavy and these abstracts that are so very helpful also, we will be sharing the knowledge. And what do we need to do in the Mexican case that we should learn from the US? You have the luck to have the American Law Institute that makes model laws that the entities take. We have 32 civil codes, and each one of them is different in what is marriage or paternity or divorce reasons. And we have such a great mobility of population that we need to unify those laws so that people can have certainty. It is like in contracts. If we look at the different norms of international commercial law, we have many problems to establish the uh, law that should rule our contracts. I see this in the European community. They are revising the contracts that they uh, uh, and that the companies and the laboratories entered for these for the current crisis. What are they doing? They're analyzing what are the stipulations uh, with which they were able to finance projects for thousands and millions of vaccinations that are now necessary. So this opening that is approaching us to you, Mexico, the U.S. and Canada, and we have a commercial treaty that affects our legislation. We have to see also that students, like the U.S. students, could access the Mexican courts and also have that knowledge in our countries without thinking of what limits us or discriminates us in our studies on matters that are going to have consequences on both sides. I think this change will make us to reflect the things that we had learned. We can cast aside and we can focus on more important issues and problems that we'll have. I see in the case of Mexico and many countries that are have revised their legislation on rent and leases because of the pandemic. What to do about homes and commercial property uh, in our country? Things as simple as an electronic last will and testament that could be acknowledged. There should be, if they find that I have COVID and I can go to a doctor uh, to be seen, if I can go to the doctor to be seen, I'm certainly not going to a notario to issue a last will and testament. Um, so it's necessary to be able to have recorded or video recorded last wills and things like that. Well, thank you so very much. I really appreciate your attention. And even though Juan Vega owes me an invitation to come and see you and talk to you in person, my experience is more in the civil and the family law and also criminal law. Someday I'll come out and visit the University of Arizona. And, and you'll see a justice in Bermuda shorts and with a baseball cap. with the Arizona aid like you all have. And then the two security people I had were melting because it was so hot on a visit that I did at some point. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you, even if it's virtually through this platform. And congratulations for your effort, and say hello to Juan Vega, who deserted before the time was up. Have a happy Friday and a happy weekend. And we will send you the information that I talked about, and we'll stay in touch. And I'm at your service for anything that you may need. And sorry I took from you your afternoon. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, señor ministro. Yo creo que de parte de la directora del programa. ¿Sí puede hablar? Ok. Yo creo que la profesora Miguel Stearns.
Sí, estoy aquí. Muchísimas gracias, su señor.
Gracias a usted, profesora.
Es un placer tener usted con nosotros esta tarde. Y el decano, Miller, le manda sus gracias.
Mis agradecimientos,
Sí.
señora directora, y al señor decano.
Gracias.
Gracias. Y que estén bien y disfruten, por lo menos tómense una cerveza a mi salud, que debe de hacer un... Muy bien, muchas gracias.
Salud.
Muchísimas gracias y mucho gusto, señor ministro. Muchas gracias y lo esperamos por aquí después, con el favor de Dios.
Sí, tal vez en un año usted puede visitarnos en persona,
Claro,
en vivo, y
claro.
tener una clase en vivo.
Será un honor.
Sí, para nosotros.
Para mí también. Muchas gracias.
Muchas
Felicidades.
gracias.
Muchas gracias. Hasta luego.
Adiós, adiós.